Have you ever wondered why animals sometimes behave strangely around certain people? Sometimes their instincts pick up on things that humans fail to notice. This is a story about a family dog that started growling at a child's door every single night. At first, the parents thought it was nothing, just a weird quirk. But when the father finally decided to investigate, what he found left him completely horrified. This story serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes our pets are trying to tell us something. They can sense danger in ways we don't understand. And in this case, the truth behind the dog's behavior would shake the entire family to its core. Stay with me until the end to find out what really happened, because this is a story you won't believe. John and his wife, Sarah, lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood with their 5-year-old son, Tim. They had a beautiful home, a happy life, and a loyal German shepherd named Max. Max had been with them since he was a puppy, growing up alongside Tim. He was more than just a pet, he was family. Protective yet gentle, Max had always been affectionate toward Tim, never showing any signs of aggression. That's why, when Max started growling at Tim's bedroom door every night, the family was puzzled. At first, John and Sarah thought it was just a phase. Maybe Max had heard something outside, a raccoon, a stray cat, or even the wind rattling against the windows. But as the nights passed, Max's behavior only intensified. Every evening, as they put Tim to bed, Max would sit by the door, ears perked up, body tense. The moment they turned off the lights, a low, menacing growl would rise from his throat. It wasn't a playful sound. It was deep, guttural, almost as if he were warning them of something unseen. Sarah brushed it off, laughing nervously. Maybe he just doesn't like Tim sleeping with the door closed, she suggested. But John wasn't convinced. Something about the way Max was acting felt off. He wasn't just growling. Sometimes he would paw at the door, his nails scraping against the wood. Other times he would bark suddenly in the middle of the night, waking them up in a panic. One night, John tried an experiment. He left Tim's door slightly ajar, hoping that maybe Max would calm down if he could see inside the room. But that didn't help. Instead, Max stood in the hallway, staring into the darkness of Tim's room, his body rigid. His fur stood on end, and his growling became more intense. It was as if something or someone was inside, and Max was trying to keep it at bay. John felt a shiver run down his spine. He had never seen Max act this way before. What was he sensing? Was it a shadow, a reflection, or something far more sinister? Each night, the tension grew, and each night, the mystery deepened. Little did John know, the truth was far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. John couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Max's behavior was getting worse, and now, even during the day, he seemed on edge. He stayed close to Tim at all times, his protective instincts heightened. Every evening, as bedtime approached, Max would grow restless. The moment Tim was tucked in, the growling would start. Low, rumbling, and steady. Not the kind of growl a dog makes when they're playing, but one filled with warning. John and Sarah started paying closer attention. They checked Tim's room thoroughly, looking for anything that could be triggering Max's strange reaction. They examined the windows, checked under the bed, and even moved the furniture, thinking maybe there was a scent or sound that only Max could detect. But they found nothing. Everything seemed normal. Despite their efforts to reassure themselves, the feeling of unease grew stronger. One night, after putting Tim to bed, John decided to stay up and observe. He sat in the hallway with Max by his side, waiting to see what would happen. The house was silent except for the occasional creaks of the wooden floors settling. Then, at exactly midnight, Max's ears perked up. His body tensed. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from his throat. John felt a chill run down his spine. He strained his ears, listening for any sound, footsteps, whispers, anything. But the house was deathly quiet. Max suddenly lunged forward, barking loudly at the door. His claws scraped against the wood as if he was trying to get inside. John's heart pounded. He pushed the door open, expecting to find something, anything, that would explain this madness. But Tim was fast asleep, his small form curled up beneath the blankets. The room was undisturbed. Nothing seemed out of place. John exhaled shakily and ran a hand through his hair. Maybe Max was just being overly protective. Maybe there was no reason to be afraid. He gently led Max away, but the dog resisted, still fixated on the room. His eyes, sharp and alert, never left Tim's bed. That night, John barely slept. Something wasn't right, and he was determined to find out what. John couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The way Max acted, so tense, so aggressive at night, it wasn't normal. Max wasn't just barking at shadows or reacting to strange noises. He was guarding Tim's room like something was inside, something unseen. The thought made John's skin crawl. He knew he couldn't ignore this any longer. That night, after Sarah and Tim had gone to bed, John sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at the baby monitor they had set up in Tim's room when he was younger. It had been months since they last used it, but now, John felt an overwhelming need to watch. If Max was reacting to something real, maybe the monitor would catch it. Max lay beside him, restless. His ears twitched at the slightest sound, and every so often he would let out a low whimper, his eyes darting toward the dark hallway leading to Tim's room. John glanced at the clock. It was 11:45 p.m., almost midnight. He adjusted the volume on the monitor, making sure he could hear every little sound. The screen displayed a grainy image of Tim sleeping peacefully, his small chest rising and falling with each breath. The room looked just as they had left it, his stuffed animals neatly arranged on the shelf, his nightlight casting a soft glow across the walls. Nothing seemed out of place. Then, as the clock struck midnight, Max suddenly sat up. His body went rigid, his ears standing straight. A deep, menacing growl rumbled from his throat. John's pulse quickened. He turned his attention back to the monitor, scanning every inch of the screen. For a moment, everything remained still. Tim shifted slightly in his sleep, but nothing seemed unusual. Then, just as John was about to relax, something changed. The baby monitor flickered. The soft glow of the nightlight dimmed, almost as if a shadow had passed in front of it. John's breath caught in his throat. His fingers tightened around the monitor as he leaned in closer, and then he saw it, a faint movement near the corner of the room. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. A slow, shifting darkness, something that shouldn't be there. His blood ran cold. He stared at the screen, his heart pounding in his ears. Max suddenly let out a fierce bark and bolted toward the hallway, his claws scraping against the wooden floor. John jumped to his feet, his body fueled by a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He raced after Max, nearly tripping over himself as he ran down the hall. He threw open Tim's door. The room was still, silent. The only sound was Tim's soft breathing. The nightlight flickered slightly before returning to its steady glow. John's eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement, any sign that what he saw on the monitor had been real. But there was nothing, just the quiet, still bedroom. Max, however, was not convinced. He stood at the foot of Tim's bed, his body low to the ground, teeth bared. His deep growls vibrated through the room. He was staring at the closet. John swallowed hard. The closet door was slightly open, just a crack. A feeling of dread washed over him. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears as he reached for the closet handle. His fingers trembled slightly, but he forced himself to grip the knob and pull the door open. Inside, Tim's clothes hung neatly on their hangers. His shoes were lined up at the bottom, just as they always were. Nothing seemed out of place, but Max didn't back down. He stepped forward, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Then suddenly, he let out a sharp bark, lunging toward the back of the closet. John jumped, his breath hitching. He reached out hesitantly, pushing the hanging clothes aside. And then, his heart stopped. There, in the shadows of the closet, something was there, something he hadn't noticed before. His mind raced. Was it just his imagination? Was the dim lighting playing tricks on him? But then, he saw it clearly. A small hidden door at the back of the closet. A door he had never noticed before. A door that was slightly open. John felt a chill crawl up his spine. His hands turned clammy as he stared at it. Where did it lead? And more importantly, who or what had opened it? Max let out another growl, his body tense and ready. John took a deep breath and reached forward, his fingers brushing against the cold wood. He hesitated for just a second before gripping the edge and pulling the door open wider. What he saw on the other side made his blood turn to ice. John's breath caught in his throat as he pulled the small hidden door open. The air that seeped out from the darkness beyond was stale, thick with a strange, damp smell. His fingers trembled as he reached for his phone, turning on the flashlight to shine it inside. The dim glow revealed a narrow passageway, barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through. The wooden walls were old, rough, and covered in dust, as if the space had been untouched for years. Max's growls deepened, his body rigid. His eyes were locked onto the dark opening, his hackles raised. John swallowed hard, his heart pounding like a drum inside his chest. He had lived in this house for years, and not once had he known about this hidden space. How was that possible? And more importantly, who or what had been using it? Taking a deep breath, he crouched down, trying to peer inside. The passage seemed to stretch further into the darkness, its destination unknown. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He didn't know what he expected to find, but every part of him screamed that something wasn't right. Then something caught his eye, a faint movement, a flicker of something deeper inside the tunnel. His stomach twisted into knots. He wasn't alone. Without thinking, he scrambled backward, his breath coming in short gasps. Max barked furiously, stepping between John and the hidden opening, his teeth bared. The sudden noise seemed to break whatever trance John had been in. He had to act. Now. His first instinct was to wake Sarah, to get Tim out of the room immediately. He had no idea what was inside that passage, but he wasn't about to risk his family's safety. He turned on his heels, moving quickly toward the bed where his son lay sleeping, completely unaware of the hidden terror just feet away. But just as he reached for Tim, something happened that made his blood freeze. A sound. A soft, almost imperceptible shuffling from within the tunnel. John's hands tightened into fists as he turned his gaze back toward the closet. The darkness within the hidden passage seemed to shift as if someone, was lurking just beyond the reach of his flashlight's beam. Then a whisper. Low, raspy, impossible to make out. John felt his entire body go cold. He wasn't imagining this. Someone was in there, watching, listening. Max snapped, barking wildly, his body lunging toward the passageway, ready to defend his family. But before John could react, something else happened. The hidden door, without any warning, began to close, slowly, silently, as if something on the other side was pulling it shut. John's breath hitched. He grabbed the edge, trying to yank it back open, but it resisted, like an invisible force was keeping it closed. His heart pounded in his chest as panic took over. He wasn't about to let whatever was hiding in there escape, or worse, come out. With one final tug, he managed to wrench the door back open, his flashlight darting through the passage. But it was empty. No movement, no figure, no whisper, just an eerie, endless tunnel stretching into the darkness. John stumbled back, his mind racing. Was this some kind of sick joke? Had someone been living inside their home, sneaking in and out of this hidden space? And if so, how long had they been there? His stomach churned at the thought. His mind flashed back to all those nights Max had growled at Tim's door. Had someone been standing there, just behind the walls, watching his son sleep? John knew he couldn't leave it at that. He had to find out where the passage led, but not tonight, not now. He slammed the hidden door shut and grabbed a chair, wedging it against the closet to keep it sealed. Then, he scooped Tim up into his arms, his little boy stirring slightly, but not waking. "Sarah," he whispered urgently, shaking her awake. She groggily opened her eyes, confusion written all over her face. "John? What's wrong?" He didn't even know how to explain it. All he could say was, "We're not staying here tonight." He wasn't taking any chances. Whatever was lurking inside that passage, it wasn't gone, and he wasn't going to wait for it to come back. Sarah sat up quickly, her eyes filled with confusion. "John, what are you talking about? What do you mean we're not staying here?" John clutched Tim tightly in his arms, his breath still uneven. He didn't know how to explain it without sounding insane, but he knew one thing. Something had been inside their home. Something had been watching their son. "I'll explain later," he whispered urgently. "We need to go, now." Sarah glanced at the closet, where the chair was wedged against the door, and then at Max, who was still growling lowly, his body tense and protective. She could see the fear in John's eyes, something she had never seen before. Without another word, she nodded and got out of bed, moving quickly. They gathered only the essentials, a few clothes, their phones, keys, and a flashlight. John didn't want to waste time. Every second they stayed in the house felt like a risk. His mind kept replaying the sound of that whisper, the slow movement of the hidden door closing on its own. He felt sick just thinking about it. Max stayed close as they hurried out of the house, his ears flicking back every few seconds as if he was still listening for something. As soon as they stepped outside, the cold night air hit them, but John barely noticed. He rushed to the car, placing Tim in the back seat carefully before turning to Sarah. "We're going to a hotel," he said firmly. "I don't care how crazy this sounds, but something is in that house, and I need to figure out what before we go back." Sarah looked pale, but she trusted him. "Okay," she said, getting into the car. John took one last glance at the house as he slid into the driver's seat. It looked normal from the outside, just a quiet, peaceful home. But he knew better now. Something dark was hiding inside. As they drove away, John's mind raced. Who built that passageway? How long had it been there? And most importantly, had someone been using it? After checking into a small hotel on the edge of town, John made sure the doors were locked before finally sitting down on the edge of the bed. Sarah sat next to him, rubbing her arms as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. "John," she said softly, "tell me everything." He took a deep breath and began to recount everything. The baby monitor, the whisper, the hidden passageway. Sarah's face paled with each word, her hands tightening around the blanket draped over her lap. "Are you saying someone might have been in the house with us?" she whispered. John swallowed hard. "I don't know, but I'm not going back until I do." Sarah exhaled shakily, glancing toward Tim, who was still asleep. "What do we do now?" "I'm going back tomorrow," John said. "In the daylight. I'm going to find out where that passage leads." Max, who had been lying near the door, let out a small whine. He wasn't calm yet. He knew, just as John did, that the danger wasn't over. That night, John barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that dark tunnel, the shadowy movement, the whisper. Who had been in that space? How long had they been watching? And the worst question of all, were they waiting for them to come back? The next morning, the light outside felt almost too bright. John woke up with a sense of dread hanging heavy in his chest. His thoughts were clouded with the memory of the hidden passage, the chilling whisper he had heard, and the feeling of something, or someone, lurking just out of reach. The hotel room felt too safe, too temporary. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in the house was still waiting for him. After a quick breakfast, John and Sarah packed up their things. Tim was still asleep, oblivious to the danger they had narrowly escaped. John knew he couldn't let his son go back into that house, but he also couldn't just run away without answers. They made their way back to the house, the familiar sight of it now feeling like a trap. Max, who had been unusually quiet the entire morning, stood in the back seat of the car, staring at the house with a focused intensity that sent a shiver down John's spine. "I don't like this," Sarah muttered, her voice tight. "I know," John replied, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "But we need to know what's in there." When they arrived, John parked the car at the curb and sat for a moment, staring at the house. It looked the same as it always had, peaceful, quiet, ordinary. But John knew better now. The house held secrets, dark secrets. As he stepped out of the car, Max immediately began pulling on the leash, dragging John toward the door. The dog was agitated again, his tail stiff, his growls soft but persistent. The closer they got to the front door, the more Max resisted. "Max, easy," John said, trying to calm him, but Max was having none of it. His growls deepened, his body trembling as if sensing something John couldn't. John's mind raced. Should he call the authorities? Was he overreacting? No. He had seen too much, heard too much. There was no turning back now. He reached for the door, hesitating just a moment before he pushed it open. The house was eerily quiet, almost too quiet. He stepped inside, the air thick with tension. Max's growls echoed down the hallway as the dog stayed by his side, refusing to leave him for even a moment. Tim's room was at the end of the hallway, and the closer they got to it, the heavier John's steps became. The house felt alive now, filled with secrets, the walls seemingly pressing in around them. He couldn't explain it, but everything about the house felt wrong. When they reached the door to Tim's room, John paused. Max was practically vibrating, his body tense, his eyes locked onto the door as if it held something far worse than just a simple bedroom. John reached for the handle and opened the door slowly. The room was as it had been the night before, quiet, undisturbed, save for the dim light filtering through the window. The toys were still on the shelf, the bed was made, but something was different. Something had changed. Max stepped into the room first, walking cautiously, sniffing around the room as if searching for something. His nose twitched, and he walked in circles, growling softly. He stopped in the center of the room, suddenly alert. John's gaze shifted to the closet. The hidden door, the one he had wedged shut the night before, was wide open. His stomach dropped. Had someone been inside again? "Sarah, get Tim," he whispered hoarsely. He couldn't think straight. Every instinct told him to leave, to get out while they still could, but his feet wouldn't move. His eyes were locked on that door. Sarah grabbed Tim from his bed, her face pale with fear. Max stood in front of them, blocking the doorway, still growling. John stepped closer, his heart racing. His fingers trembled as he slowly approached the closet, his mind running wild with 1,000 possibilities. As he pushed the door open, the darkness inside seemed to swallow the light. This time, however, there was no shadow moving, no whisper, just an empty space. John exhaled shakily, trying to calm his racing heart. Had it been his imagination? Had he been chasing ghosts? But then something caught his eye. A small, old piece of paper, crumpled and half hidden beneath the floorboards at the back of the closet. He reached for it, his fingers trembling. It was a letter, yellowed with age. With shaking hands, John unfolded the paper. The words were smudged, faded, but he could make out part of it. "We are not alone. They are still here. Don't trust the walls. Don't trust the silence." The rest of the letter was too faded to read, but it didn't matter. The meaning was clear. John's blood ran cold. Whatever was in this house wasn't just a strange occurrence or a twisted coincidence. It was something far more sinister, something that had been lurking here for a long time. Max began barking frantically again, his ears pressed back as if something was just beyond his reach. John knew in that moment that they hadn't even scratched the surface of the horrors hidden within these walls. He turned to Sarah, his eyes wide with fear. "We have to leave, now." They gathered their things quickly, and with Tim in his arms, John didn't look back. He couldn't. They drove away again, but this time John didn't feel any relief. The letter, the hidden passage, the feeling of being watched, they weren't just figments of his imagination. They were real, and whatever was in that house was still waiting. Thanks for watching this story until the end. If you enjoyed this and want to hear more creepy tales like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling mysteries. Stay safe out there, and always trust your instincts.